Good afternoon. The purpose of this interview is to capture the history of Ifa USA branch and its early, very important players. And this interview was set up and coordinated by Peter Connors and Peter Glicklick, who we owe our thanks to. I'm Steve Cohen, member of Ifa as well. And today in particular, we're honored to be in the home of David R. Tillinghast, who is a person I think that has some great memories to share with us of Ifa players as well as the Ifa organization. Maybe before we begin our back and forth, just a few words about Ifa in general. The organization was formed in Europe by a gentleman named Mitchell B. Carroll, Mitchell Carroll, who was a member of Treasury that negotiated some of the United States' earliest tax treaties in Europe. But in 1938, he made it his business to form this organization. And then shortly after World War II, together with a couple of other people, he organized an informal group called Ifa USA. And that occurred after Mitchell B. Carroll retired from Treasury and started his own law practice. In fact, I think some of the earliest members of Ifa were his clients.
I think that's right.
And that would have been in the 1950s. Our interview today is with David R. Tillinghast. And he began his career after graduating law school at Yale in 1954. He did have an illustrious athletic career at Brown University, where he played basketball and I understand was an excellent swimmer.
Fortunately, we don't have to go into that.
And we won't. Although it probably came in handy dealing with government at times.
Sure did, yeah.
But in 1954, David joined a law firm of Hughes Hubbard, and after his education, he stayed in touch with one of his professors of tax named Boris Bitger, who very much appreciated the hard work and intelligence that David brought to the table. So David began his career and had some international tax work at Hughes Hubbard, wrote considerably, and after 6 or 7 years, think of this, some of the young people listening to this, after 6 or 7 years as an associate, he came to the attention of another professor at Harvard University, Stanley Surrey, who had just been asked by the Kennedy administration to take over as Assistant Secretary for International Tax Policy. And I think the two of us were thinking that that's probably by recommendation of his professor at Yale.
Yes.
And David got a call from Professor Surrey and came to Washington. And we'll talk about that. That's a part of the career of David's that took a shift 6 years into his time. So a couple of other things about David, aside from the fact that he was probably the first effectively international tax counsel for the U.S. government at Treasury from the years 1962 to 1965. Much more recently, I mean, perhaps for the last 20 years, after being a professor of international tax at NYU, NYU has what's called the David R. Tillinghast Lecture on International Taxation. It's the Graduate School of Taxation at NYU, and it's named after David, which I think is a wonderful honor. So enough of the good stuff. Let's move on to talk a little bit about Ifa and some of your recollections. Now, as I recall, I'm not sure that you were a part of Ifa or a member of Ifa until you joined government.
No, I don't really remember. He was active, contentious person, but he was an academic, and he perceived that as being a disadvantage, which of course it was from time to time. So he was shopping around for someone who could give him a little advice about what really happened out there in the world. And, I can't remember, I wrote something, I think.
An article, I believe.
I wrote an article, and I can't remember who gave it. Got a job with him, and
And you were a bit of a connection to the private world, international tax advisor
Yes.
world, so that I think Professor Surrey had a voice of his own, but you were to some degree his
Oh, yes.
voice in,
Sure.
in Ifa.
well, he was an academic and a full-time academic, and he correctly conceived that other things happened in the world
Right.
that he needed to know about.
In terms of Ifa people, Hugh Alt and you were both were active
Yeah.
and active in
Well,
governments
Hugh
as well.
and I had accepted a commission from Surrey, do a treatise
Ah.
on international tax issues.
Weren't you in 1960 working with the Kennedy administration about deferral and how to handle that? Or maybe they aren't so different. It sounds
Well,
like the same issue.
I don't know. I mean, I guess that Hugh and I did work with the Kennedy administration, but I'm not sure that that implies that they listened to anything we said. No, but seriously, I mean, I think what happened was that the administration was doing its thing,
Right?
and someone said, maybe we ought to ask somebody whether
Right.
this is in the real world
Right.
or not. And so they
Reality check.
Yeah, so they came to us and we sort of told them, well, it wasn't in the real world, but what else was new?
Huh. You say they may not have listened to you,
No, they made some changes.
but you and I had a conversation some time ago where you said you were in the office when I believe it was Assistant Secretary Surrey said to you, "We're going over to the White House."
Yes, the president had said something that suggested that there might be an issue about whether there ought to be a current tax on foreign trade. And so we were hired to go down and talk to him about it, which we did. And I'm not sure that I remember that there was any specific response, but we did it anyhow.
You were in the Oval Office?
No, not in the Oval Office. We were in a secondary office.
That's still pretty good. So
Yeah.
you are now 8 years out of law school,
Yeah.
and you're sitting in the room with the President of the United States about
Yeah.
any issue.
Hear about it. Any of the things we wanted to talk about. So
What year? Probably 1962. I think he had some things on his mind back then.
yeah, and started before I
And,
got
and maybe you didn't see it, but when we're talking about making the policy, you were describing the administration as being somewhat interested in the big picture, but the details were all being worked out at Treasury.
Sure.
And that would have been Professor Surrey, or Assistant Secretary Surrey, and you and Hugh Alt. You guys were making the policy involved in Subpart F. Now, that's either a for better or for worse, and you can say, I don't remember.
I think that's what I'll do.
President Reagan did that very well, I
Yeah.
remember.
Well,
On the other hand, maybe focus on the parts that you do remember, which are wonderful.
Yeah, well, I had a very interesting career.
Amazing career. Thank you.
So good to see you. Thanks for
best.
coming.